Thanks to Professor Haug for that outstanding presentation. Thank you. When I was in communication with Father Nick in the planning stages of this particular day, there was a question as to what the title of the whole retreat should be and what the focus, and we went back and forth on certain things. We landed on the idea of Bible basics, and to round out the day, I wanted to kind of finish on the note of basics, maybe going a little bit beyond Bible themes per se, but still to cover some of the things that we would consider to be basic ground for Orthodox Christians who want to be able to communicate 4 or 5 things about their faith in connection with the society around us. And I thought to myself, well, I had been asked by the Interfaith Clergy Association back in the Lansing area, tell us something about the Orthodox Church. We're going to give you a session. You're going to tell us about your church. We think we know things, but there's probably more that we can learn. So I got together a little talk on that, and that's what I'm going to give you today. Before I ran it through with the interfaith group, though, I decided to run it past the local OCF group. And what I discovered was that our young people, our intelligent college-age young people, didn't know certain of the things that I'm going to talk about. So I thought it might be, for that reason, a good set of basics to cover to round out this day today. Being as I am, of a certain age, and growing up with David Letterman on TV, I was always amused by his top 10 lists. And so this particular talk is cast in the form of a top 10 list of things that you maybe didn't know about the Orthodox Church. And I mean you, not just the interfaith clergy that I address this to, but even us Orthodox Christians. So I will read you my top 10 list of things that you maybe didn't know about the Orthodox Church, and then having read the list, we'll go through item by item to discuss them. So, the top 10 things. Number 10, there's no such thing as the Eastern Orthodox Church, nor was there ever a Byzantine Empire. Number 9, you should know, Orthodox Christians have no spirituality. Number 8, we have fools for saints. Number 7, we have no images of the Virgin Mary in our churches. Number 6, we read Moses in the original Greek. Number 5, our God never gets angry. Number 4, our babies are not born with the smell of forbidden fruit on their breath. Number 3, no one goes to heaven after they die. Number 2, we fired our best theologian, and so now we're down to just 3. And number 1, when we talk about God, we Orthodox sound like atheists. So that's my list. Anyone curious as to the furthermore details? I see it in your eyes. Number 10, there's no such thing as the Eastern Orthodox Church, nor was there ever a Byzantine Empire. Among us Orthodox, one finds many adjectives in front of the word Orthodox: Greek Orthodox, Russian, Serbian, Ethiopian, Finnish, Romanian, etc. This leads some people to believe, even within our church, that the Orthodox Church is not one entity, but several related organizations. And sometimes those ethnic descriptors are replaced with the supposedly catch-all term Eastern. But something that one doesn't really find in careful usage by the Orthodox ourselves is the expression, the Eastern Orthodox Church, I Anatoliki Orthodoxos Ekklesia. This is something that Western people use for their all-embracing term for the different Orthodox people taken together. But we do not, when we're being careful, we do not use it, because we as Orthodox do not perceive ourselves as being Eastern in relation to something that is Western, nor do we perceive ourselves as being relevant to only one half of the world or anything less than the universal and Catholic Church, Catholic in that original sense of the church throughout all the world. Actually, the one descriptor that is accepted by all Orthodox is Helleniki, the Hellenic Orthodox Church. And this word Hellenic does not refer to the nation-state of Greece, but rather to the matrix of Christianized Hellenism from which our church emerged. Even the patriarchates of Alexandria in Egypt, of Antioch in Syria, and of Jerusalem in Israel refer to themselves as Hellenic Orthodox, whether their clergy or laity are Africans or Arabs or Palestinians. They're not Greek necessarily, but they are Hellenic in their mindset, in their orientation. Likewise, the Russian Orthodox even. I meant to bring with me the patriarchal Imerologion, and if you look up the pages for the different patriarchates, they say in their official titles, the Hellenic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, of Antioch. You can find it on the web if you go to the websites. So there is no such thing as the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's just the Orthodox Church. And we as Orthodox should banish that title Eastern from our own description of ourselves. Furthermore, the empire that had its capital on the Bosporus was not known by any of its citizens at the time as the Byzantine Empire. This terminology was invented by Westerners later on. But for the members of that empire, it was perceived as the continuation of the Roman Empire, just from a different capital city. The capital was moved from Rome to over here. The city of Byzantium was renamed Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And the other name for Constantinople is New Rome. And the patriarch of that city is not called the Bishop of Byzantium, but rather the Bishop of Constantinople and New Rome. And to this day, in Turkey, the Turks refer to the Christians of that land as Rumi, Romans, right? So, no such thing as a Byzantine Empire until long after the Byzantine Empire had disappeared. The form of address for the ecumenical patriarchate is Rum Patrikanesi. His Eminence knows from first-hand experience. This is all more than a historical nicety. It explains certain things in world politics even today. Because after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453 AD, there was a sentiment among the Russians that now Moscow was the next Rome, the third Rome. And they say, a fourth there shall not be. And by this they mean that Holy Russia and its patriarchate have inherited the rank and the privileges of Old Rome and then New Rome. And so that Moscow is now to be regarded as the capital of the entire Christian world, and that its political ruler should be hailed as the new Christian emperor. And it's for this reason that the Russian kings came to be called czars, for czar is simply the Russified form of the word Caesar from Latin, right? A czar is a Caesar. This theory of the third and final Rome is by no means official teaching of the Orthodox Church, and certainly is not the teaching of the Church of New Rome, still in Constantinople, that its primacy has been passed on to Moscow. But it does explain why sometimes the Patriarch of Moscow perceives himself as being a little bit independent of the work of Constantinople, and why Vladimir Putin perceives of himself as being, in some ways, the real leader of the Christian world. So, that's number 10. Number 9, Orthodox Christians have no spirituality. When you hear someone talk about Orthodox spirituality, they are using non-Orthodox terminology. Because if you read the classical Orthodox theological literature, the Church Fathers, you don't really find that word spirituality, which would be pneumatikotis, right? Orthodox spirituality, not a thing. Orthodox theology conceives of us human beings as a body, soul, spirit unity that can't really be separated out. So there's not something that you address to the spirit that doesn't also affect the body. The two are intertwined. So instead of the word spirituality, which seems to talk only about a part of the human being, the earliest theologians of the Orthodox Church used another word, philosophia, philosophy. And in particular, St. Gregory, the theologian of our church, called Christianity many times in his writings our philosophy. And I just came across a sermon by St. John Chrysostom recently where he talked about Christianity as philosophy, but in the translation that is on most of our shelves, it's translated as high morality. But no, the word philosophia, that was their sense of what Christianity was. Not a spirituality, but a philosophy. But not philosophy in the modern sense, as a kind of abstract mental calculus that all takes place up in the head. They meant philosophy in the ancient sense, as a holistic path of wise living. Not just ideas, but diet and music and clothing and your daily schedule, your hygiene, your exercise, your activities. Think of the ancient philosopher Pythagoras and that all-embracing philosophy of life that he constructed based on vegetarianism and mathematics and certain kinds of exercises and study. The early theological writers of our church did the same thing. And these ways of life, this philosophy of wise living that they developed, eventually evolved into the monastic rules, like you know from the rule of St. Benedict, which actually comes from the earlier rules of our own St. Basil, which were rules not really just for monastics, but for all serious Christians. Rules about how you eat and how you behave and how you address one another. And the point of these rules is to lay out a manner of life that's governed by Scripture and reason, not by feelings or intuitions or emotions of the Spirit. Secondly, the earliest theologians understood the Christian religion. That's a word you also don't find so much in their writings. They understood it to be within the tradition of and really building on the philosophical heritage of the ancient world. And so the pagan philosophers are embraced in Orthodox theology just to the extent that they got certain things right. And if you go, for example, to Greece, to some of the monasteries, you will find in the exonarthex of the churches icons of Socrates and Plato and the Sibyl and other of the earlier philosophers, for they were perceived as making way for the message of Christ in the world by opening up the mind of the world to philosophy, to wisdom. In the ancient world, the garb of the philosopher was a plain, dark, simple robe, not adorned, not dyed in different colors. And this style of dress was adopted by the earliest Christian theologians, and it has morphed into the black, plain clergy garb of today. This means I'm a philosopher. I'm sorry? And I'm in Detroit. Thank you. I am indeed in Detroit, Your Eminence. Item number 8. We have fools for saints. Speaking of philosophers, one of the great philosophers of the ancient world was Diogenes the Cynic. His was a philosophy of happiness that was won through simplicity. He constantly challenged societal norms in order to show how artificial the veil of respectability was that we drape over our lives. And he challenged those norms by openly violating them in ways that seemed crazy, but also made a point. So Diogenes didn't have a house. He had a big ceramic tub that he would roll around town and move to wherever he wanted to be. He had a drinking cup for a while, and then when he saw a little child drinking from the fountain by using his hands, he threw away his cup since he realized he didn't really need it anymore. Diogenes did a whole bunch of things that were even more outlandish than this, which we don't talk about in the church. But anyway, in the Orthodox Church, there are a number of people who have come to be recognized as saints, as truly holy people, for doing things a little bit like Diogenes did. They challenged the norms. They violated them openly. And we call these people in the Orthodox Church holy fools, or fools for Christ. The Greek word is salos, the plural sali. And this is based on St. Paul's words in the first letter to the Corinthians, where he speaks of the wisdom of Christ, the wisdom of the message of the cross, as being foolishness to the world, but wisdom for those who are being saved. And he says that he and the other apostles are fools for Christ's sake, whereas the Corinthians are, in their own eyes, wise and strong. So these holy fools, or sali, they disdained conventional morality and behavior, and that puts them as part of that ancient Hebrew prophetic tradition, as when Isaiah, the prophet, went about naked and barefoot for 3 years, or the prophet Hosea married a prostitute, or when Ezekiel laid down next to a brick for a long time. The holy fools of our church, they spoke rudely to their social superiors. They dressed strangely or scantily. They would feign insanity or idiocy. They would speak in riddles or rhymes. And they went out of their way to abuse the high and mighty. They might, for example, interrupt church services. They might eat meat on fasting days. They might do other things to speak truth to power in a way that the regular people did not dare to do. An example from the history of Russia: there was once a time when Tsar Ivan the Terrible entered a town during his reign of political terror. His intention was to massacre the inhabitants. But there was among the Russian people a holy fool by the name of Basil, not Basil the Great, but Basil the Fool. And he came to Tsar Ivan during a meal, and he dropped a piece of raw meat on the table, and he invited the Tsar to eat. And this was in the middle of Great Lent, when no meat is allowed, and the Tsar refused the food on the grounds of his religious scruples. And Basil the Fool replied, Ivasko, Ivasko, which is Russian for Johnny, Johnny. Do you think it is unlawful to eat the flesh of a beast, but lawful to eat so much human flesh by your massacres? Now, Ivan the Terrible would have killed anyone else who talked to him that way. But with Basil the Fool, there was a holiness there that even that dead-hearted Tsar could recognize. And so he meekly accepted the rebuke, and he spared the town. It's in Russian Orthodox culture especially that these holy fools have a special fascination, and they appear as figures in the writings of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow is actually named after that Tsar-baiting beggar who dressed in rags, rather than the Cappadocian church father Basil the Great of the 4th century. Number 7, we don't have any images of the Virgin Mary in the Orthodox Church. Well, you know that we Orthodox Christians have a real sense of familiarity with our saints. And the saints are felt in some way to be present with us in vague and maybe undefinable ways, and that though they lived maybe 2,000 years ago and on another side of the world, they're still with us and watching over us. And so the Orthodox use icons of their holy ones as a way of expressing their sense of closeness and love for saints. And of all the saints, after Jesus Christ himself, the most beloved is, of course, the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary. Even so, if you go to our Orthodox churches, you will find icons of St. Nicholas, of St. Matthew, St. John the Baptist, other individual saints, but you will never find a similar icon of the Virgin Mary. What you will find are icons of Jesus with his mother, or of Mary with her parents. I don't know that we have that here. Over there, there, or of the Virgin Mary with the Archangel Gabriel, or with the Virgin Mary from some other scene in church history with other people, like at her Dormition. That will be up in the back, I'm sure. But of the Virgin Mary alone, like you see St. Nicholas, is strictly disallowed. There she is at the Annunciation, part of the bigger icon with the Archangel Gabriel. Strictly disallowed for her to be alone. Why? Because it's important in our church that she has her significance only in the role and the relationship that she has with the one to whom she gave birth. And I think there was wisdom among the early church in making this rule, because it would have been easy for recently converted pagans to find in the Virgin Mary some way to revive their familiar forms of goddess worship. And so this liturgical fence was put around her to prevent this. No icons of her by herself, always with her son or with other people. Also, unlike maybe the other people in the Orthodox Church, our holy saints, the Virgin Mary has a particular symbolic role. She is seen as a representation of virtue itself, or of particular virtues like compassion or holiness or gentleness, or as symbolizing perhaps the ideal Christian, or of the church in general, or of the people of God throughout the ages, even as a representation of the whole human race. And so many of the doxological and theological statements that we make about her play on her role as a symbol, and they were not articulated to be historical claims. This, however, is not something that's always well understood, even by us Orthodox ourselves. Number 6, we read Moses in the original Greek. And if you were here this morning, you heard a little bit about that. That's my curious way of saying that for the Orthodox Church, the canonical text of the Hebrew Bible is the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the mid-3rd century BC, and not the Masoretic text of Jewish scholars from around 800 AD. What we say is that you can't get closer to the original text than the Septuagint, which is thought to be an inspired translation. And someone at the lunch break said I should tell the story of the Septuagint, and that person was right. So there is a story. Whether it is mostly history or partially legend is not clear, but that the king in Alexandria of Egypt in the mid-3rd century BC decided that his people needed a translation of their scriptures, the Old Testament, the Jewish people needed, that they could read in the language that they now spoke, which was Greek. And so he commissioned 70, or sometimes it said 72 scholars, to make that translation. So he gave them each their own room and their own books and parchments to work with and said, get translating. And then at the end of the project, they took all the translations and compared them, and they were found to be identical. This is the miracle of the Septuagint. Now, again, which part of it is historical, which part of it is legendary embroidery, it's hard now to say, but it was received as a miraculous gift to the Jewish people, this Greek translation, and as an inspired form of Scripture. This is important, though, when we say that our text, our canonical text of the Old Testament is the Septuagint, because what we're saying is that it prevents us from a kind of scriptural literalism that's all around us here in America. I think sometimes there's this feeling in American society that the conservative Christian approach is literalism, and that being orthodox, whether it's with a big O or a small o, being orthodox means being a fundamentalist. And so if you're orthodox, you have to believe in six-day creation of a young earth that's only 6,000 years old, etc. All these arguments that you hear going on in the church world around us. But historically, this is not correct. The earliest exegetes, the interpreters of the Bible in the church, did not take the opening chapters of Genesis literally. And for that matter, as we said earlier today, they didn't take a lot of things literally. And I read you that quotation from Origen. But the idea is, in the Orthodox Church, we know we don't have anymore the actual original letters, the ABCs of the Hebrew text. So what's the point in trying to be literalistic if you know you don't have the actual original letters? What you have, though, is the meaning in a translation that is conceived to be from the hand of God in its own way. And so accepting that non-Hebrew text as our canonical text saves us, in a sense, from the literalism which other people working with translations in society around us fall into so easily. So we read Moses in the original Greek. Number 5, God never gets angry. Orthodox interpreters of the Bible will often say that the Scriptures say things unworthy of God, that he hardens hearts against himself, that he prefers arbitrarily one human being over another, or that God has body parts like an ear or an eye or a hand or feet. These passages are not taken at face value among the Orthodox. In the same vein, there are statements in the Bible about God having emotions, and these are not taken at face value. So it says in the Scriptures that God gets angry and then he gets over it. But emotions, or to use the technical term, passions, pathe in Greek from the singular pathos, emotions are inconsistent with the unchangeable perfection of God, right? You have an emotion, your mood changes, and then it changes to something else. But God is unchangeable. So what would it mean for God to have an emotion like that? Apatheia is our Orthodox word, Greek word, for impassibility, which means freedom from passions, from changes of state, from emotions. We say God has apatheia, God is apathos. Despite the apparent testimony of the Scriptures, God does not get angry at one moment, nor rejoice at another, nor shed a tear because a human being rejects him, nor does he pine away sometimes or have remorse about his dealings with humans. To the extent that we impute these qualities to God, we're simply generating an invisible imaginary friend for ourselves, much as a young child might do for the purposes of reassurance or comfort. But to take such stories literally is to fashion an idol for worship and not to worship the real God. Salvation in the Orthodox Church means not being rescued from God's anger against us, but being rescued from the deceptions of the devil, from the distortions and delusions that are imposed upon us by that great thief. This apatheia, this passionlessness, this unemotionalism plays a huge role in the spiritual traditions of orthodoxy, because the role of religion is godliness, godlikeness. One element of growing back into the image and likeness of God is for humans to develop their own powers of apatheia. And one of the purposes of our spiritual exercises, like fasting, like prayers, like vigils, is to be able to overcome our passions and emotions, to be masters of them and not them of us. And this isn't to say that our emotions are evil, but rather they're too often untamed, and therefore they're unhelpful. And so this is one of the great differences between Orthodox spirituality, if I can use that word, and other kinds of Christian spirituality. In the Orthodox Church, there is not this emphasis on spiritual encounters that lead to emotional highs or mountaintop experiences. We're having this retreat today. We've enjoyed our company and we've learned a lot, but we're not here to be brought to a moment of tears and fits of hysteria. We're here learning and growing. His Eminence is making a face at me. But this is not a mountaintop experience. And our worship, likewise, is not geared towards providing a lift or enthusiasm. Our liturgical gestures are performed with an absolute economy of motion. His Eminence has said to me more than once, before the holy table, he likes his priests to be operating like those doing a Japanese tea ceremony, where every motion has a reason and there is no movement without a reason. So not a lot of fidgeting in front of the altar, but calmness and self-possession. Correct? Correct. It's through this control of soul and mind and body, or that's the goal, and the subordination of feelings to reason and to good measure in all things. This emphasis on apatheia, on passionlessness, permeates our Orthodox worship. The holy faces in our icons do not smile or frown. They simply radiate a joy that comes from a place beyond emotions. And our Orthodox church music has almost the quality of ambient music. There's a steadiness without rubato or a kind of point of climax. If I have any issue with some of the church music that's being produced by our Orthodox church musicians today, it's that they want to get this sense of climax and feeling and classical, room to it. And that's not Orthodox music. Orthodox music is steady and calming and peaceful. If you go to the monastery, the chants, even of the most joyful types or the most sorrowful, have the same kind of evenness of tone and quality. The differences in the emotional character are conveyed by the differences in the musical scales and not by greater volume or really hitting high notes or deep low notes or things like that. In our Orthodox worship, the readings from the New Testament are intoned, not simply read. And not just because the chanting adds a kind of beauty, but because by intoning, you remove the possibility to a large extent of adding individualistic emphasis or an investment of emotion. And in some Orthodox worship, like the Russian traditions, even the Creed and the Lord's Prayer are recited through singing rather than speaking. And in regards to our personal spiritual formation, in Orthodoxy, spiritual guides are often marked by a kind of lack of affect. They're almost like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, aren't they, in their habits and their conversation. They're not warm and fuzzy. They're not fiery or tearful. They speak softly and seldom, but they are not without their own gentle sense of humor either. And so the upshot is this: in the Orthodox understanding, God never gets angry, and for the most part, neither should we. Number 4, our babies are not born with the smell of forbidden fruit on their breath. I am often asked by parishioners what the differences are between Orthodoxy and Catholicism or Orthodoxy and Protestantism. And you can spend a lot of time talking about priestly celibacy or baptism by immersion or what kind of bread we use in communion. But when I want to cut to the chase, I get down to the question of original sin, which in my mind comes very nearly close to the biggest distinction. In short, Orthodox theology does not have an idea of original sin, which is the idea that the whole human race is guilty for the transgression of Adam and Eve, or this idea that guilt passes down through the generations through the process of human reproduction. We say that that idea of original sin developed because of a mistranslation of some words in the Greek of Romans 5:12. And I've written them out on here. I don't know how well you can all see it. But Romans 5:12, St. Paul is talking about how sin and death came into the world. And he says the reason that we die, epho pandes imarton. Epho pandes imarton. And the question boils down to these 3 letters. It's the preposition epi combined with the relative pronoun o, or ho, hos actually in the original ancient Greek. And when you put them together, epi, hos becomes epho. And in the early Latin translations, this was taken in kind of a one-to-one fashion. Epi is in, hos is quo, in quo omnes peccaverunt, which means in Latin, in whom, meaning Adam, that's how it's understood, in Adam, everyone sinned. That means somehow, when your DNA was somehow still in Adam, and he took a bite of the apple, you were there, and you are guilty of eating the forbidden fruit. And when you are born, you are already born guilty of that sin. Doesn't matter what else you did that. You ate that fruit you were forbidden to eat, and so you are born with the smell of forbidden fruit on your breath. But there's a problem with this Latin translation. It doesn't recognize the fact that this is really a compound word, and that epho in Greek, in the ancient Greek, doesn't necessarily mean in whom, but it can be a compound preposition meaning because. So, everyone dies, we all have mortality, because everyone, bandes, imarton, everyone sinned. A huge difference in understanding. In other words, you are not condemned to death because you ate that forbidden fruit being inside of Adam's DNA. We all die because of our own personal acts of rebelling against the law of God and of sin. This is such a very big difference between our churches. I can't even tell you, having grown up in Calvinism, which very strongly has a sense of original sin, very strongly has the sense that every child who is born into the world comes as a fully formed sinner. You start out not innocent, but as a sinner. And the difference in child rearing even between the Calvinist tradition and what I see in the Greek Orthodox tradition tells the tale of the difference in understanding of those two small words from Paul's Greek in the Epistle to the Romans. And from this understanding of original sin, or our rejection of that understanding, all these other differences between Orthodoxy and Catholicism fall out, and even Protestantism to an extent. So priestly celibacy goes back to the issue of the sinfulness that is spread by human reproduction, right? If making babies makes sinners, then priests better not make babies. Or the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Well, we don't want her to be a sinner from birth, so we say she was conceived differently from the rest of us. Or papal infallibility. If we're all born sinners, then it's not to be trusted that we would have enough measure of the Holy Spirit among all of us to understand things through conciliarity. It just takes one special guy with a special throne who can define what Christianity is for all of us. So, our babies, though, are not born with the smell of forbidden fruit on their breath. Number 3, in Orthodox theology, after death, no one goes to heaven, and everyone goes to heaven, and everyone goes to hell. The Orthodox Church, in comparison to the Catholic Church or the Protestant churches, have defined relatively few things as dogma, which is required beliefs, and a great many things are left as theologumena, or matters where a reasonable difference of opinion is allowed. Our dogma is contained in the Nicene Creed and the declarations of the ecumenical councils, but with regard to certain other things, the Church takes a stance of patient agnosticism, not unbelief, but rather not committing to any particular belief. And so we say that we don't know because it hasn't been revealed to us, and we would do wrong to indulge in speculation. And the Church takes this agnostic stance about life after death. We say that we know this: there will be a general resurrection, that is a reunion of body and soul for all human beings. We say that there will be a judgment and a reward for all people. We say that there will be a new or renewed earth with a new or renewed humanity. But beyond that, what happens to your soul as your body lies in the grave, we do not say because we do not know, because it has not really been revealed to us. And so the state of the soul after death is a matter of particular ignorance. We do not, if you read our liturgical text in connection with funerals and memorial services, we do not say that a person goes to heaven or to hell. We use the expression Hades, which is not to be understood in the Greek mythology sense of the term, but simply as a label for a kind of unknown condition in which a human consciousness exists and awaits resurrection in the body and for divine judgment. We speak of paradise as a condition of relative rest and comfort for the souls of the just. But this paradise is not in scriptural understanding nor in Orthodox understanding the same as the heaven in which God dwells. And so in contrast to the mainstream view of American culture, Orthodoxy mostly says that no one goes to heaven when he dies, excepting certain saints whose holiness immediately lets them be ushered in to the presence of God. But with regard to the state of human beings, not after death, but in eternity, that is to say, after the return of Christ and the general judgment, there is a strong strain of thought in Orthodoxy that heaven and hell are the same experience, namely the direct presence of the face of God. And for those who love God, the light of his divine countenance will be an unspeakable delight. For those who hate God, the brightness of his presence will be like hellfire. I just came back from Florida about a week ago. My last day there, I took a long walk on the beach. I was outside for about 3 hours. It was wonderful. If I had done that my first day there, I wouldn't have enjoyed the rest of my vacation because I would have burned to a crisp. But because I had built up my tolerance to the light of the Florida sun, I was able to enjoy it, and the sun was a delight to me. I got my vitamin D levels back up to where they need to be. But if you are not in this world accustoming your soul to the presence of God, the brightness of his countenance, which we talked about earlier, will be like the brightness of the Florida sun to pale, white, Midwestern flesh. So heaven and hell are the same experience in some strains of Orthodox thought. It's not that God is punishing the wicked, but they're simply suffering from the scourge that is his love, the love of his presence for human beings. And so in this sense, everyone goes to heaven and everyone goes to hell because ultimately our destiny is to come before the presence of God. Number 2, we fired our best theologian, and so now we're down to just 3. Evagrius of Pontus, a 4th century mystic and monk, said something very influential. He said, "The theologian is the one who prays, and the one who prays is a theologian." The Orthodox Church ended up not accepting some of his ideas, but this sentence and some of the other ways that he thought guide the sensibilities of our church still to this day. And what this sentiment is that theology is not the product of scholarship, but of the direct experience of God for one who comes into God's presence in prayer. It was in this same vein that St. Gregory the theologian once wrote, "Not to everyone, my friends, not to everyone does it belong to philosophize about God." You see the word philosophize, not theologize, but philosophize. "Not to everyone, because it is permitted only to those who have been examined and who are masters in meditation and who have been previously purified in soul and body, or at the very least are being purified." That's what a theologian is. This title of theologian is given to only 3 people in the Orthodox Church history. St. John the Evangelist in the 1st century, St. Gregory, the Bishop of Nazianzus in the 4th century, St. Gregory the theologian, and St. Simeon the New, the younger Simeon, in the 10th century. Those are our 3 theologians. We don't count anyone else really worthy of the title at that level. Yet, there was once another, the one who was probably the greatest mind in Christian history, and one whose thought permeates the Orthodox Church more than anyone else's. His name was Origen of Alexandria. Origen lived in the 3rd century. He was a scholar par excellence and a man of highest virtue. He was given the nickname Adamantius for being so flinty in his resolve to live for Christ. He wanted to be a martyr, and in his youth he intended to go out and find the Roman soldiers who were rounding up Christians for persecution and hand himself over. But while he was getting cleaned up and in the bath, his mom hid all his clothes because she didn't want him to be a martyr. And so, not willing to go out naked, he stayed home and lived. In his old age, he missed being a martyr. Just by a little bit, he was tortured for his faith as a Christian, but he survived his tortures long enough not to be counted as a martyr. He wrote, it is said, 6,000 books. of which very little still exists. It was Origen who St. Basil and Gregory were quoting in that thing from the Philokalia I read this morning, and Origen steered the church away from literalism, and he exemplified the work of the Bible interpreter as a person of prayer, who begins in prayer and ends in praise. In his own day, he was regarded as a master theologian. Origen, says St. Gregory the theologian, was the stone that sharpens us all. It was centuries later that elements of Origen's speculative thoughts were condemned by a church council. He had ideas about the pre-existence of souls before our birth, and about the restoration of all rational beings, even the devil, to perfection in the long run. Origen was always careful to separate his scriptural exposition from his metaphysical speculation, but there were those after him who tried to follow him, who started making mistakes and weren't so careful, and Origen ended up taking the fall for all their mistakes. And to add insult to injury, in his own lifetime he was slandered as someone who castrated himself in his younger days out of a misplaced enthusiasm for the commandments of Christ, but there's no real evidence of this slander having any truth in it. In fact, it seems like a story contrived just in order to defame the person who espoused non-literalistic interpretations of the Scriptures, to slander him by saying he took an overly literal interpretation of Christ's command to cut off body parts that cause offense. So if you want to understand Orthodox theology, Origen is a great person to start with, and I recommend to you that book, the Philokalia of Saints Basil and Gregory, which are a collection of his writings. Finally, number one, when we talk about God, we Orthodox sound like atheists. One thing that Origen and Evagrius of Pontus taught was that one had to guard the mind always during prayer from fixing on any physical or mental images of God. To know God is hard, said Plato. To describe him is impossible. St. Gregory the theologian amended this. He said, to tell of God is not possible, but to know him is even less possible. The human mind is incapable. Only the heart, through love, can know God, can experience God. And so Orthodox theology tends away from descriptions and discussions and speculations, and tends towards something called apophaticism, which is what you don't say. We don't try to define God, except to say what he is not. And many of our adjectives for God, in the original Greek, begin with the letter alpha. It's called the alpha privens. It's that not prefix in ancient Greek. So God is not visible, aoratos. God is not comprehensible, akataliptos. God is not definable. God does not have passions or emotions. God does not have a body. He is asomatos. God is not this and not that. He is beyond all essence and all being or any kind of created nature. And what this means is that the process of coming to know God is often a process of unknowing, of giving up all those mental idols that are less real than the real God. And so we as Orthodox are theists. We believe in God. But our theological dictionary has a whole bunch of adjectives in the letter A section, all these words beginning with the Greek alpha privens. We are theists who describe God largely in terms by how we do not conceive of him, how we do not fall into a trap of reducing him to a mental image. For this reason, our favorite word in Orthodoxy is mystery. God is a mystery. The Holy Trinity is a mystery. Human nature is a mystery. The union of human and divine in Jesus is a mystery. Life after death is a mystery. The sacraments in Orthodox theology are properly called mysteria, mysteries. Not in the Agatha Christie sense of who done it. When it comes to the sacraments, we know who done it. The Holy Spirit done it. But we call it a mystery because we don't know how it was done. And so we try to avoid rationalizing or analyzing or defining. That's what it means to be Orthodox. Not to talk about accidents and essences, but simply to say, this is a gift, that this bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We don't try to reason it out. We just, in love, accept it and say thank you. Ultimately, we as Orthodox say that words fail us when it comes to God, and so we're left with the experiences of symbols and sacraments, and beyond those, with silence, which is the true language of the coming kingdom of God. This, then, is 10 things that you may not have known about the Orthodox Church, but I hope you may have learned something. I'm sorry? Father Nick, I'm well past time. Do we want to stop or have a question or two?
A couple of minutes for questions. 2-3 minutes.
2-3 minutes for questions. There's someone standing there.
Orthodox Patriarch met with the Pope in Havana. The news media were all over this as an historic reconciliation between two religious rivals after more than 1,000 years of schism. My perception was when Patriarch Bartholomew met with the Pope a couple years ago, the media coverage was lukewarm. Am I off base? Am I biased? Do you see the same thing? Are the media somehow biased toward Rome and Moscow and not Constantinople? Should we care? Does this matter? But I got the feeling that this was a big event in Havana, but what happened 2 years ago was just an also-ran, third-page story. Thank you.
If you're asking my opinion, I couldn't agree more. I see the mainstream modern media as being largely PR people for the elites, including the Roman Church, and to a certain extent what's going on in Moscow today. So, yeah, I think you're not wrong in your perception that there was a mismatch of the coverage of the two different events. I would agree with you.
Cosmologists are telling us now that they have scientific proof that we can only see a small fraction of the universe, and the rest of the universe is full of stuff called dark matter and dark energy, and they're wondering, well, what is that? It's everywhere. It's between the little spaces between the electrons and the atom and so on. But us Christians, it's an easy answer. It's the Holy Spirit, silly. Does that make sense?
Well, I wouldn't say that the Holy Spirit is something measurable or quantifiable like dark energy and dark matter seem to be. But in our Nicene Creed, we proclaim that we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, who is the creator of heaven and earth and of all things visible and invisible. And we have always maintained that there are beyond this visible realm whole realms of invisible creation which mystical minds sometimes have experiences with, and maybe even we ourselves occasionally in dreams find ourselves in contact somehow with those invisible realms. But for the most part, those realms are not something that we have direct experience of. But they're there, we say, and it's in those realms that are populated by the different species of the angels and the different species of the fallen angels and the other fallen powers. And in terms of what kinds of material invisible realm there is, we don't know. We don't have an experience of it. But my own sense is that what the physicists are measuring, if they're really measuring something, is perhaps the first clues of that realm out there that we've always been talking about, but they're only now beginning to pick up that it's an influence on the life of this visible realm. That's my gut answer. The church, I don't think, has any particular teaching on the issue of dark matter or dark energy. I myself wonder if in 20 years physicists will still be talking about it. I think I have a physicist from Michigan State in my parish, and he freely admits that modern physics is in a real state of chaos because they haven't made any genuine progress now in several decades, and it's time for the whole paradigm to get turned over and for a new way of looking at all kinds of things and reinterpreting the data that they've been amassing all these decades with their atom smashers and things like that. So I don't really have an answer beyond that.
I'm having a little, I don't know, misunderstanding about God not showing any emotion, because Jesus clearly shows emotion in many of the scriptures.
And Jesus was, like us, fully human. And that emotion comes from the human in Jesus. That emotion is not an expression of his divinity, it's an expression of his humanity. There's a quick follow-up.
Stand up against God and His Christ.
Together, yes, against
Then he says, en orgi aftu, in His wrath, He will turn against them. Ke en to thimo aftu, taraxi aftus, and in His thimo, He will trouble them. If we use your notion, or the notion, that God is not showing emotion or wrath, may we then interpret that correctly, that we are experiencing His righteousness and His love as wrath, but because of our sinning.
I think what you just said is actually, there are among the church fathers sermons and treatises on this very topic, and my memory is they say exactly what you say, that the wrath is our word for our subjective experience of God's righteousness and love. We don't like it, so we call it wrath. It's like a child being disciplined by a parent. You know, don't stick your finger in the socket. Don't stick your finger in the socket. Don't stick your finger in the socket. Well, when this comes, the child thinks that mom hates him. Mom really loves him dearly and is saving the child from great pain. So I think you're on the right track. Father Nick?
Thank you very much, Father Mark. Thank you all for coming. There's a few more minutes. You can look at some of the texts in the back.